Can everyone hear me okay? All right, good. Thank you for coming, especially given the weather. I'm going to try to survive this bright light. I'll probably have a sunburn by the time this is over. The program I'm going to give today is kind of interesting. A few years ago, I gave a talk here called the Civil War in Alabama. At the beginning of the sesquicentennial in 2011, I gave a talk called The Road to War. Now I'm giving a talk about the end of the war. So if you take the second talk I did and put it in front of the first talk I did, put it as number 2 and put this one up, you have a trilogy. And you can watch these really nice silver highlights appear in my hair over these years. The beauticians had to work really hard to do that for me. Anyway, I didn't plan it that way, but I'm glad it just turned out that way. And I hope I will do Spanish Fort and Blakely justice. I'd like to thank Graham Neely, Meredith McDonough, and Ryan Blocker, who all contributed to this program I'm about to do. This is actually the third time I've done this one. I did it at the very beginning of PowerPoint, and things have really improved. I really like the 21st century technology, and if we hang around, we might make this a motion picture. I don't know. I think it might advance that far. Anyway, thank you again for coming, and as you can see, the topic of my talk is Mobile 1865, the siege and reduction of Spanish Fort and Fort Blakely. Now, what brings us to 1865? Every good talk has a prequel. Every event has a prequel. The prequel to Mobile 1865 is Mobile August 5th, 1864, the Battle of Mobile Bay. What you're seeing here is phase 2 of the Battle of Mobile Bay. People think it's all one thing. It isn't. The federal fleets run past the forts. Then the CSS Tennessee comes down to do battle with the federal fleets. Then there's the siege and reduction of Fort Morgan, which comes later. The siege and reduction of Fort Morgan actually occurred on August 9th through 23rd, 1864. Now, following the fall of the forts, Mobile Bay was essentially a bottle with a cork in it. No blockade runners could get in, no Confederate vessels of any type could get out, and no blockade runners could get out. There were actually a few trapped inside the bay. The Federals, if they had moved quickly against Mobile, might have taken it. But there's a good chance they would not have. Mobile was considered one of the most fortified cities in the Confederacy. Most of this was due to 3 engineers who had worked there during the war. The forts kept getting stronger, bigger, and stretching further out from Mobile. Also, they were very innovative. They had submarine torpedoes. We would call those mines today. They had harbor instructions. Mobile was really a well-fortified city. So part of the delay in moving against Mobile was dealing with all of these fortifications. This man was going to make things even harder. The Federals gave him time to fortify the eastern shore. This is one of my favorite Confederate officers. His name is Colonel Samuel Lockett. He was born in Marion, Alabama in 1837. His parents were double first cousins. That's a whole nother story. And a good one. He graduated second in his class from the United States Military Academy in 1859. He was the engineer at Vicksburg. If you go to Vicksburg today, where all those fortifications are preserved, you'll see a bronze bas-relief monument based on this portrait honoring Samuel Lockett. He later taught at LSU, where Lockett Hall is named after him today. He also taught at the University of Tennessee. After the war, William Tecumseh Sherman mentioned him and recommended him to the Egyptian government as the best engineer on either side during the war. He said of him, he built the strongest fortifications that I could never take. He was later principal assistant engineer, building the base for the Statue of Liberty. Not the pedestal now, but the base. He died in 1891 in Bogota, Colombia. As you can see, this is what the eastern shore would look like. And when I say they gave him time to fortify the eastern shore, the Federals were going to have to come up the eastern shore to attack Mobile. With the fortifications at the harbor's interior, all of the obstructions and all of the mines, and if you don't think the mines were a threat, even after Mobile was taken, a total of 9 Federal vessels struck mines and sank, probably more than in any other harbor. In fact, all of them probably put together during the Civil War in the South. So Lockett's fortifications fortifying the eastern shore would prevent them from coming over and taking Mobile directly. This man is the guy that comes up with a plan to take Mobile. This is Brigadier General Edward Richard Sprigg Canby. He's born in 1817 in Kentucky. He's essentially a Southerner. Graduated West Point in 1835. He fought in the Seminole War and the Mexican War and was fighting Indians at Fort Defiance in New Mexico when the Civil War began. He was made commander of the Department of New Mexico. He frustrated Sibley's attempts to evade Mexico and then served as adjutant general in Washington, D.C. He commanded troops in the New York draft riots and was promoted to brigadier general after the war. He was very good at negotiating surrenders. One, however, he failed at. In the 1870s, he was negotiating with Captain Jack, a Modoc warrior in the lava beds in California. On April 11th, 1873, Captain Jack became pretty frustrated with Mr. Canby and he killed him with a knife. Canby's plan was a good one. What's going on in the rest of the war affects what's happening down in Mobile, and what's happening in Mobile affects what's going on with the rest of the war. At the time he's pulling his plan together, Grant has Robert E. Lee bottled up in Petersburg, Virginia. Sherman's army has departed Savannah and is moving through the Carolinas. Joseph Eggleston Johnston, the remains of the Army of Tennessee, and everybody else he could pull together is trying to retard Sherman's advance. Stoneman is in North Carolina, so they're busy on all fronts. Down here in Mobile, the objective is partially Mobile, but more than Mobile is Selma, Alabama. By this time, Mobile's pretty much been neutralized. As I said, nothing can get out, nothing can get in. But you can't go past Mobile. You've got to neutralize those fortifications on the eastern shore. So basically what Grant told Canby was, take Mobile if you can, but if you can't, take the forts and move on towards Selma. Assisting Canby was Frederick Steele. Frederick Steele was a native of New York. He attended West Point in the same class as Grant, remained in the Army after the war, and in 1868, while on vacation in California, he fell out of his buggy and later died from his injuries. Steele's over in Pensacola. The plan is Canby is going to come up. Hold on, let's see if I can find my fancy pointer here. I've got it somewhere. Ah, there we go. Canby's men are going to come from New Orleans. They're going to come in here by water and move up this way. The troops at Fort Morgan are going to march down this peninsula and come up the eastern shore. Frederick Steele and his men, which consist of 13,200 men, including Hawkins' brigade, which are African-American soldiers, are going to come up from Pensacola. They'll basically come up what is Old Palafox Highway, Highway 29. They'll take a left at Flomaton, and they'll come around and invest Fort Blakely up here from the north. So you've got Canby's men, which consist of 32,200 troops, Steele's column of 13,200 men, making a total of 45,400 men. Now, while this is going on, this gentleman, James Harrison Wilson, is coming down through central Alabama, basically from up here, down across here, and he's targeting Selma. He's got around 13,500 well-armed troops. So the idea is he will come down, they will take Mobile, they will come up and help him, they will then take Selma, they'll move toward Montgomery, and then move on toward Georgia. Now, the reason for knocking out Selma is it is the second largest industrial facility in the South, second only to Tredegar in Virginia. They made literally everything, and if you can look at this map, you'll see why things from Selma literally could go anywhere in the Confederacy. In Mobile, Dabney Maury is put in charge of defending the city and the fortifications on the eastern shore. Dabney Maury was 5 feet 4 inches tall. He was called Little Dab. As one soldier put it, he was every inch the soldier, he just didn't have that many inches. He had a habit of wearing large cavalry boots, so they also called him Old Puss in Boots. Born in 1822 in Fredericksburg, Virginia, he was raised by his uncle, Matthew Fontaine Maury, the pathfinder of the seas. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy in 1846. His left arm was shattered by a musket ball during the Mexican War, and he served in New Mexico as Assistant Adjutant General of the Department of New Mexico in the Federal Army before the war. So clearly he knew Canby before the war. He was promoted to Brigadier General after Pea Ridge, and in 1863, after 2 years of service in the Western Theater, he was ordered to Mobile as commander of the Department of the Gulf. After the war, he founded the Southern Historical Society in 1868 and was chairman to 1886. He was U.S. Minister to Columbia 1885 to 1889, and he died in 1900 in Peoria, Illinois. The man who would be directly in charge of Spanish Fort was Brigadier General Randall Lee Gibson. Gibson had served as a U.S. congressman and a senator after the war, and he died in Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1888. Hey, this is Spanish Fort. You can see this is Fort McDermott, the line of fortifications leading to the redoubts. This area up in here, and talking to Craig Sheldon, this is called Red Fort. Craig, did I get it right?
Yes.
All right. And then this is Spanish Fort. And just so you know, Spanish Fort, we don't really know what was there before the war. It was called Spanish Fort, but there's been nothing found that's Spanish that we know of. The fort literally is a 5-gun battery that was designed to cooperate with 2 batteries that were over on the other side of Mobile. There's really no landward defense to it. How do you lay siege to a fort? And I'm going to have to walk out there to show you. The first thing you do is set up your mortar batteries, which are here. These guys are going to lob explosive shell over into the fortifications that you're laying siege to. And here's your fort way up here. While this is going on, breaching batteries here, which will fire directly into the walls of the fortification, are constructed. While that's going on, men are going to come up here to the side and they're going to do a little zigzag trench. That way they can't fire directly down your trench. Then they'll construct what's called a parallel. And in this parallel, they will put in bomb proofs to protect them because these guys are shooting back. They're not letting this happen. They will go out in front, construct another line of fortifications, making a zigzag trench to what you call your second parallel. So they're slowly going to work their way up to the fort. In the fort, they've got wire entanglements, trip wire. They've got bastions that will protect the corners of the fort. They have sharpened stakes sticking out, which are called free. If you do them in an X, they're called chevaux de free. They would also cut trees, drop them forward, and cut the limbs on the tree, and that's called an abattis. All of this is French, of course. And here's everything I just described. If you look, you can see the federal lines, you can see their zigzag trenches, you can see their gun emplacement, and out in front, these little V's are all rifle pits. So the Confederates, not just sitting in the fort, come out and construct their rifle pits too. The campaign actually began on March 17th. Canby moved out, came up the eastern shore exactly as we said. They constructed these fortifications, and this siege is going to last for 13 days. The fort, as I said, was originally designed, Spanish fort, was designed to protect batteries Huger and Tracy. You've got 1.5 miles of fortifications there, which include 6 heavy guns, 14 field pieces, and 12 cohorn mortars. The fort was built primarily by impressed slaves, and I don't mean people who think this is a really cool fort. Okay, impressed slaves were actually taken from their owners who were paid $1 a day for their service. They were uniformed in what was called inspected and condemned Confederate uniforms, and this explains many of the sightings of African-American Confederate troops marching in formation. They're actually in those uniforms marching off with picks and shovels over their shoulders. They are insured by the Confederate government, so if they're mistreated in any way, the owners have to be paid back by the governor. There were a total of 1,810 men in the fort. After gathering his forces near the Fish River, Canby began his march to the fort on the 25th, as I said, with 32,200 men. He's also supported by the Navy. Skirmishing began on the 26th, and the siege began on the 27th. Now, a member of Lumsden's battery described the siege, and I'll read this to you. On March 26th, he arrived before us, entrenched, and we had several lively artillery duels while he was so doing. By April 4th, he had in position 38 siege guns, including 6 20-pound rifles, 16 mortars, 37 field guns. When he opened fire at 5 o'clock a.m., and continued to 7 a.m. And so until April 5th, 6th, and 7th, on April 8th, he had 53 guns in position and 37 field guns. Closer and closer came the parallels, each morning finding the Federal trenches closer by the day before, until if you exposed any part of the body, either Yank or Confederate, you would draw several bullets. Men standing with rifles at soldiers beneath the headlogs and finger on trigger, ready to fire at the least motion shown in the opposite direction. We were furnished each man with a rifle, as well as our artillery, and our shoulders got sore from the continued shooting. In one day, the sharpshooters in Spanish Fort expended 54,000 rounds of ammunition. And that's why you'll find mini balls and percussion caps there forever. On April 8th, the Federals had 96 pieces of artillery, including 53 heavy guns. One of my favorite characters in the siege of Spanish Fort's a Confederate private named Stevenson. Mortar shells particularly take a long time to get to the ground. The first shot of the Civil War fired at Fort Sumter, the mortar shell that exploded above the fort, had a time of flight of 54 seconds. 54 seconds is a long time. Well, this one guy, Stevenson, got really good at figuring out where they were going to land, and the men watched him running back and forth, avoiding these explosive shells. It eventually got to the point when they would hear one fire, they would scream out, "Sing out, Stevenson, tell us where it's going." This is what Spanish Fort looked like during the siege, and everything I just described is there. You're seeing the embrasures for the breaching batteries. The guns have been removed. Directly in front of that is your first parallel, and there are the header logs. Those keep you from getting shot in the head if you're a sharpshooter. You dig a little dirt out underneath, stick your gun in there and shoot. Now, if an explosive shell goes off in front of you, it rolls over you and kills you. So they eventually learned to put poles behind those so that those would roll over the poles. You'll see those in photographs. Here's your second parallel, third parallel, fourth parallel, and fifth parallel. If you go to Fort McDermott today, which is actually that little thing right there, that's all you will see. All of this is out there underneath the subdivisions. Way over here is Spanish Fort. These are the Federal bomb proofs that I was telling you about. Now, on the 13th day of the siege, the Federals at dusk made their charge. When they got in the fort, there was no one there. The Confederates had evacuated. They knew it was coming. They had a small bridge built, and they were able to evacuate the fort, be picked up by steamers, and escape. Except for the 18th Alabama. They were out there in the rifle pits, and nobody told them they were evacuating. So the 18th Alabama, after the Federals took the fort, stood up, walked in, and said, "Don't shoot, Yanks, we're coming in." And this is what Spanish Fort looked like on the night of the final assault. One of the relics that survives from Spanish Fort is the flag of Lumsden's battery. This is part of our collections. It was captured by Federals, recaptured by the Confederates, and later donated to the department. This is what it looks like after conservation. Now, while all of this has been going on, don't forget about Frederick Steele's column. He has come up from Pensacola. He makes it to the area where Flomanton is, makes that sharp left, and Brigadier General James Holt Clanton is sitting there waiting for him. Clanton is one of my favorite characters in Alabama history because he was my great-grandfather's regimental commander, for one, but also Clanton's sort of unsung. This is the man that really started the Battle of Shiloh. They were maneuvering around there at Pittsburgh Landing. They had captured a Federal soldier. The Federal soldier escaped. Clanton took off after him all by himself and chased him right into the Federal lines, letting the Federals know where the Confederates were. If that weren't bad enough, once he caught the guy, or he didn't catch him, he chased him out. He had numerous holes in his coat, brought him back to the Confederate lines and captured him. When he did that, they claimed that Clanton opened the Battle of Shiloh. Braxton Bragg, who I have no respect for whatsoever, said, He is brave even unto rashness. That means he does stupid things. Clanton did it one last time at Canoe Creek. He was in command of the 6th Alabama Cavalry. He had around 300 or so cavalrymen. He turned and made a parade ground maneuver to retard the advance of Steele's 13,500 men. Not only was he shot all to pieces, so was the regimental colors. The regimental colors was captured by a federal soldier from Louisiana, later forwarded to the War Department. Clanton was so badly wounded he couldn't be moved from the field, so the Federals said, when you get well enough, report to Fort Barrancas. And he did. When he was able to move, he went down to Fort Barrancas. This is what Blakely looked like at the beginning of the siege. There's 3.5 miles of earthworks. The ditches are 4 to 5 feet deep. There are 9 redoubts connected with 40 pieces of artillery. They cleared 50 yards of trees to create the abattis that I talked about. 300 yards further out landed another line of abattis, and then there were the detached rifle pits for 6 men each. Hundreds of subterranean torpedoes had been placed in front of the fort, as there were wire entanglements. There were 3,500 defenders, consisting of Cockrell's Missouri Brigade, Thomas's Boy Reserves, the 62nd and 63rd Alabama Infantry, and some scattered Mississippi troops, as well as other Alabama artillery units. Steele's column had left Pensacola on the 1st, and they arrived on the 4th. During the siege, we talked about the amount of small arms ammunition that was expended. 169,000 rounds of small arms ammunition were expended by one of the federal units. There were truces between the lines from time to time, and the Missouri boys particularly, who hadn't been home since Vicksburg, would run into relatives and friends on the lines, and they would strike up conversations to find out how things were at home. Overall charge of the fort is Brigadier General St. John Richardson Liddell, Louisiana plantation owner. He'd spent 1 year at West Point. After the war, aboard the steamboat Black River on February 14, 1870, he was killed by a rival plantation owner. Commanding the Confederate right, the Boy Reserves, was Brigadier General Brian Morrell Thomas. He was a graduate of West Point, class of 1864. After the war, he served as a deputy U.S. Marshal and superintendent of public schools in Dalton, Georgia. On the Confederate left was Francis Marion Cockrell, commanding what was left of the famous Missouri Brigade, the boys who hadn't been home since Vicksburg. They were so mangled after Franklin, where they took 75% casualties, that they were left behind by the Army of Tennessee to recuperate. One newspaper reporter interviewed 100 of them. Every single man had been wounded at least once. There were guys missing arms and guys still recovering from losing eyes at Franklin, who would fight with them. After the war, he was a lawyer, he was a U.S. Senator, and was appointed to the Interstate Commerce Commission by Theodore Roosevelt. He died in 1905. Okay, this is, and by the way, I forgot to mention, there are 2 excellent displays just outside the doors showing this collection, which belonged to 2nd Lieutenant Maurice Garland, Company C, Confederate Engineers, and photographs of what Fort Morgan looked like after the siege and reduction of Fort Morgan. Our archival staff put those together, and it's a top drawer exhibit. This is what Garland drew when he was there at Blakely. This shows the firing step, the breast-high wall, the exterior slope, down to the ditch. In the ditch, there's a palisade. This is called the glacis, and this gives you a full field of fire at the enemy who have finally managed to make it through the abattis. He also sketched the flag that was at Blakely that day. This is one of my favorite letters. Here he's being instructed on how to make cheval de frise. And if you look at the date, that's April 7th, 2 days before the fall of Fort Blakely. And this is the cheval de frise. What did the cheval de frise look like? That. So you would have miles and miles and miles of these things out in front of fortifications that look like that. And you can see the embrasures up here in this fortification. Also in front of the fort, there were these. They called them subterra shells or subterranean torpedoes. They're basically landmines. Also helping the Confederates was the CSS Nashville, the only ironclad constructed here in Montgomery. It had not participated in the Battle of Mobile Bay, but it would participate in Spanish Fort and Blakely, and a little more later on. I'll tell you about that. Okay, this is what the Federal left looked like. You can see the fortifications there in the distance. This is the center, redoubt number 4. This is the Alamo. That's where Cockrell's Missouri Brigade is. You can see the Chevaux de Frise, the abattis, and then just debris everywhere. This is the view of the Federal right. And when I say Federal right, that's Confederate left. If you're inside, it's on your left. If you're outside, it's on your right. On April 9th, the Federals had decided that it was time to take the fort. This is the day after the fall of Spanish Fort. As I mentioned, all those guys got away. Canby wasn't going to let that happen again. He was in a hurry to take this fort. Inside the fort, this engineer is attending to business. He doesn't have enough augers to make the Chevaux de Frise. So he's requesting 2-inch augers, which are hand drills, to drill the holes in the logs to make the abattis. It's almost like, what's that noise out there? What's all that running? How am I supposed to write this letter with all those people running around? He seriously was paying attention to his part of the job. Outside the fort, the morning of the attack, it looked like this. You can see the Federal lines. Everything in blue is Federal. Everything in red is Confederate. So what you have here is 3.5 miles of fortifications that have been almost surrounded by lines that extend further than 3.5 miles. You've got Thomas's brigade here, the 62nd and 63rd Alabama Infantry, and over in here, Cockrell's brigade, the Mississippians over here. Just before this happens, let's go back for a second. Hawkins' brigade is here. The attack's supposed to take place around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Hawkins' brigade want to move. These are the African-American troops that have come from Pensacola. They strip their blouses and they begin working their way through the abattis. Once they make it through there, they charge and take the Confederate rifle pits. The Confederates, in turn, countercharge and retake their rifle pits. So this fighting goes on and on and on, from 3 o'clock until 5 o'clock. They fight unsupported. The rest of the troops are waiting for the grand assault, when 16,000 men will line up on a 3.5 mile front and surge forward. If you take 16,000 men and put them shoulder to shoulder, they won't fit. You have to turn them sideways. There were that many men attacking the fort. Of course, they didn't attack that way. They attacked in echelon. Hawkins' brigade continues to skirmish on that end of the fort. Now, the men in Hawkins' brigade are a victim of propaganda. They've been told that the men inside this fort were the Confederates who were at Fort Pillow. And if you're not familiar with the legend of the Fort Pillow massacre, supposedly, well, black troops were killed after they surrendered at Fort Pillow. There was no massacre. In fact, 800 of those prisoners helped build some of these fortifications, and they're inventoried there in Mobile. But they were told these were the guys responsible for it. Inside the fort, the Confederates were told that the men at your front had been told not to take prisoners. Fight to the very last. And that's literally what was getting ready to happen. At 5 o'clock, the rest of the men surge forward. 16,000 troops on a dead run toward that fort. They're running through the abattis, they're running through the Chevaux de Frise, they're running through ditches, they're running through debris, they're stepping over landmines, and they're tripping on tripwires. But nothing could slow them down. This is what it looked like when they attacked the fort. These guys here are going to go over and break through right there. They literally were at a dead run coming down these earthworks. One Federal officer ran down firing his revolver, shooting artillerymen. It moved that quickly. Thomas's men here, as I mentioned, the Missouri Brigade there, and over here the Mississippians. And to give a little clearer look, that's what it would look like. And what basically happens is these guys here break through right there. Thomas's boys turn and form a line here. Over here, where this 2 hours of fighting has gone on, Cockrell has split his command and sent his Missourians over to help out here. They've held for 2 hours right here. But his men now, there's 10 feet between each man in this part of the fort. The Confederates here are pushed back as the Federals are breaking over the line here, here, and here, and push back upon Cockrell. They fire one last volley and then start making for the river. Cockrell's men have been reinforced by the guys who have come back. They realize that while they're holding their front, they're being taken by enfilade. So they turn and start fighting here. And this is what it would look like in Redoubt number 4. Literally, it was the Alamo, and the men literally tried to fight to the end. The Federals could not believe that they would not throw down their arms and surrender. But finally, they did. The men in Fort Blakely, only about 200 of them escaped. They managed to make it to the river. They were picked up by the ironclads. The ironclads I mentioned, and I didn't bring this up, actually came up and fired over the fortifications into the enemy troops until they discovered their shells were ineffective and they were exploding inside the guns. So they were literally raining shell fragments down upon their own men and had to help. But they did manage to make it in where they could help about 200 men escape and move upriver later on. This is the flag of the 2nd Regiment of Alabama Infantry, which was redesignated the 63rd Alabama Infantry. This was captured inside the fort. The captor was from an Illinois regiment, and like many of the men who were there, he received the Congressional Medal of Honor for capturing the flag. In fact, there were 13 medals of honor issued at Fort Blakely for the capture of 12 flags. The Federal casualties were 127 killed, 527 wounded. The Confederate casualties were 100 killed, about that, except for those who were killed or shot down at the river, and around 2,000 captured. While all of this was going on, Major Thomas Good Jones, Army of Northern Virginia, was given orders by his commanding officer, General Gordon. Lee had evacuated Richmond after the breakthrough of the Federal lines on April 2nd. Lee was trying to find his way through the Federal Army as Johnston is fighting toward Virginia through the Carolinas. Lee tells Gordon, make one more attempt to break out. If we can get through the Federal lines, it will continue. If you can't, then send out flags of truce and have the shooting stopped. Thomas Good Jones, wearing that uniform, carrying that sword, was sitting there eating some snacks that he had received the night before, which were wrapped in a napkin. He was told, tie that to your sword and see if you can get out between the lines. He did. He carried this sword, which is on display upstairs. He was eventually taken to Joshua Chamberlain of Maine. Chamberlain got the shooting started along his line. Another flag of truce, a tea towel, was picked up over at Sheridan's front. George Armstrong Custer ended up with it as a souvenir, and the shooting was stopped. So about 6 hours before the assault on Blakely, the Army of Northern Virginia had surrendered. The official surrender would be a little later. I always wondered what happened to that napkin. We were over at the library, about 2 months ago, and one of the ladies over there said, Bob, you like books about Custer, don't you? And I said, well, I don't like Custer, but I like books about him. And she says, well, I've got one here about his wife, Libby Custer. And I said, well, that's great. She said, well, do you want it? I said, sure. So I get it, and Graham and I come back over. I open it up, and there's Libby Custer's will. Well, Libby Custer got the table that Lee and Grant did the surrender thing on. Sheridan bought it for her and gave it to her. In Libby Custer's will, she left that table to the U.S. War Department. She also left the tea towel. She also left a napkin that was used as a flag of truce at Appomattox. And I just slammed the book down and said, there is no way Custer got that flag. So I started looking, and sure enough, Joshua Chamberlain, in one speech, describes how Thomas Good Jones is being brought by a federal officer toward him. He's joined by another officer. It was Whitaker, Custer's chief of staff. Whitaker witnesses the whole thing. Whitaker liked to collect souvenirs. Chamberlain said in one speech, Whitaker got that flag. I should have had it. It's even on his tombstone that he acquired one of the flags there. I had to leave. Ryan Blocker, who's sitting back there, said, Ryan, I bet if it's the War Department, it probably went to the Smithsonian. Why don't you give them a call or email and see if you can find out anything about it? When I get back, she's sort of bouncing around the room. She's gotten an email back. And sure enough, they have a white handkerchief that has something to do with Robert E. Lee and Appomattox. So I emailed the lady and said, have you read Libby Custer's will? It's like, no, it's read it. So there it is. It's at the Smithsonian. And the little piece that's cut out, I later found a letter where Whitaker took that as a souvenir. While all of this is going on, don't forget about our friend Wilson. He's already taken Selma. This map was prepared for the Birmingham Historical Society newsletter by Jim Bennett, so I appreciate Jim letting me use this. But that clearly shows the route of Wilson's raid. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'll say Wilson's raid, that was not a raid. A raid is run in there, do something real quick, and run back. This was a well-thought campaign by 13,500 men, and they had effectively destroyed the industrial capacity of the Deep South. That's what Selma looked like. And that's what it looked like after Wilson left. On April 12th, he would take Montgomery peacefully. The city fathers would go out and surrender, not before a strike force had already captured the town, but there are two different versions of how Montgomery fell, and both of them are true. Mobile peacefully surrendered on May 12th. They had evacuated all the Confederates out of Mobile, and he actually went out in a carriage, the mayor of the town, with a white sheet and surrendered the city. Unfortunately, on May 25th, 1865, stored munitions exploded and almost blew Mobile off the map. Richard Taylor, who was the brother-in-law of Jefferson Davis, he was the son of President Taylor, was in command of the Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana. He ordered Dabney Maury to take the troops that had escaped and move up to Meridian, which they did. Canby's men, meanwhile, are in Mobile. He's waiting for word. He doesn't know Lee has surrendered. They find out Lee has surrendered, but that has nothing to do with them. They do not fall under Robert E. Lee. He commanded the Army of Northern Virginia. He's waiting for word from his government. Jefferson Davis had evacuated Richmond and was in flight, and Wilson's troops were hot on his trail. Sherman and Johnston have met. They've come up with terms. These terms sound pretty good to him, so he comes down in late April and talks to Canby. They say, yeah, those are pretty good terms. Let's declare a ceasefire, and then we can surrender under those terms. Then it turns out that the Johnson administration, this is after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, did not like those terms. So they told Sherman and Johnston, no, we can't play your way. He's got to surrender under the same terms that Robert E. Lee did. Well, eventually Johnston does that. He discovers that and orders his men to prepare to surrender. He comes back down on a railroad car with one slave, and he makes it down to where Canby has drawn up his men in formation. He has a large band. They have a large dinner prepared, and they play Hail Columbia to this one Confederate officer who has come down to surrender the Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana on May 4, 1865 at Citronelle. The men who have been ordered to surrender are up in Meridian. They're told to stack arms and stack flags. This is the flag of the 32nd, 58th Infantry combined. They stacked arms, they stacked flags, and then the flag bearer went back into the camp, took this flag off his flag staff, took off his rather large boot, wrapped this around his leg, and put his large boot back on. He came out with the flag, and it eventually ended up with the Lieutenant Colonel John Washington Enzer, who lived in Asheville, and the flag was eventually donated to the Department of to the Department of Archives and History, Joseph Tillingist, who was the flag bearer of the 36th Alabama, wasn't about to give up his flag either. So he crept back into camp. He took off his shirt and his jacket, wrapped this around his torso, put on his clothes, and walked back out. This was eventually donated to the department in the 1930s. The missing parts are from the men souveniring it at reunions. Well, it's all over then, isn't it? War's over. Well, not quite. When they evacuated Mobile, Ebenezer Farrand took the CSS Nashville and he went upriver. He took one of the blockade runners and any vessel that could make it, leaving behind the Huntsville and the Tuscaloosa. They opened their valve cocks and sank them because they couldn't make the turns going up the river to Demopolis. He's still sitting up there on May 10th, 1865, awaiting orders. Finally, aboard the CSS Nashville, he comes down and surrenders to the Federals at Nanahubble Bluff. They invite him aboard. They serve he and his men dinner, and then they enjoy chilled wine and fine Havana cigars. So the war in Alabama was pretty much over. Sometimes there's a debate. Did any of this matter? Yeah, it mattered. If they had not destroyed the industrial capacity of Selma, the Army of Northern Virginia was coming home. Mobile, Selma, and Columbus would be intact. Nathan Bedford Forrest was still in the field. Jefferson Davis had not been captured. Edmund Kirby Smith was holding out in the Trans-Mississippi, and the French in Mexico looked like some pretty good allies. Jefferson Davis had sworn he would fight to the last ditch. They captured him on May 10, 1865 at Irwinville, Georgia. So if this entire campaign had not occurred, Davis would not have been captured. All of this would have been left intact. And these guys were really, really ready, as witnessed by Cockrell's men, to fight to the last ditch. So yes, the war would have still ended. It just might have lasted a little bit longer and been a little bit worse. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Are there any questions? They have a microphone they'll be bringing. I finished on time. I'm so proud of myself.
Is the Clanton man, General Z. Clanton, Alabama?
Yes, sir. Clanton's named after him. He's buried over in Oakwood Cemetery as well. All right. Well, one more.
What happened to that boat?
The Nashville? Tell him.
She was scrapped, the U.S. Navy scrapped. I have a theory that I think some of the tubes actually still exist and maybe at the Navy Yard, but the man from Sullivan, Bill Lockett, is the authority on the Brook tubes, how many were built, where they went, and he has copies of all the orders of where they were sent on.
And that sketch that I showed, we discovered that, Ed remembers, we discovered that in our collections a few years ago, and somebody had written the Monitor on it. And I looked at it and, well, that's not the Monitor. And the way we know it's the wartime sketch is on it, they wrote our first boat. So they were planning to build a second one, and we know that didn't happen. Any other questions? Well, given this weather, thank you so much for coming out.